When we think about climate change, our first thoughts are often that of either the causes of or the extreme weather events we are witnessing, such as the droughts, the floods, the fires, and the heat waves. Yet, although many of us will say that the climate emergency makes us feel a level of anxiety, we don't automatically associate the mental health risks being presented by our changing climate. For some, in the face of the world's inaction and an unknown future, this anxiety is leading to strong emotional responses such as anger, guilt, distress, and fear. And this level of emotional response can have a devastating impact on our mental well-being. In a time when our changing climate is calling into question some of the fundamental certainties we have of the world, our future, and undermines our very sense of security, in this episode we explore the age of climate anxiety. Following my own personal experiences with burnout several years ago, mental health has become a really important subject matter to me. So I'm super excited to bring this topic into our discussions. And after a long time in planning, I've had an amazing opportunity to speak with Dr. Susan Clayton, professor at the College of Wooster in the United States. She is co-editor of this invaluable book, Psychology and Climate Change, Human Perceptions, Impacts and Responses, and a contributor to the last IPCC report in March 2022. But how does psychology help us to understand the climate emergency? What is climate anxiety? Who does it affect? And how do we recognize it? Join me now as I discuss this and much more with a world-leading authority. Dr. Clayton, welcome to the channel. I'm very excited for us to have this opportunity to speak with you today. So thank you very much for agreeing to this discussion.
Yes, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
I'd like to jump straight in and ask you, what roles does psychology play in helping us to understand the climate emergency?
Well, psychology actually has a lot to contribute to this discussion, and I would say several distinct things. One is psychology can help us to understand people's perceptions of climate change. Clearly, some people are very worried, others are not worried at all. What are the factors that contribute to those different cognitive responses? Psychology is definitely important to understanding the impacts of climate change. And this is something I think people are not sufficiently aware of, but I think awareness is growing that there are these impacts on our psychological well-being. And then psychologists, of course, for as long as there have been psychologists, have focused on helping people cope with difficult situations, both through developing personal resilience and emotional skills, but also through, when appropriate, changing their behavior. So I think psychologists can help in both of those domains when it comes to climate change.
One of the things that I've experienced as I've been building my community here on the channel is that during conversations I'm having with many of the viewers, a lot of the responses come from this place of real despair when talking about the climate emergency. And there's a very strong emotional response, such as anger, frustration, shame, blame, guilt, as well as a lot of shifting of this blame. Can you tell us, how can we recognize climate anxiety, and what is it that we know and we don't know about it, and how does this differ from something that's more popular coined or known as eco-anxiety?
Well, I'll start by saying that there's a lot we don't know about climate anxiety, but what we do know is that a lot of people are experiencing these powerful emotions, as you said, anxiety, anger, guilt, distress, and fear associated with climate change, and that this has the potential to affect their mental health. So you asked how to recognize it. I would say we need to distinguish at least two different manifestations. One is just the anxiety itself, and I think many people will freely admit that they are anxious about climate change. But the other is, when does this actually constitute a mental health problem? So it is not by itself a sign of a problem to be anxious about climate change. But when that anxiety starts to impair your ability to live your life, to function, to work, to have social interactions, to sleep, that's when we start to think there's an underlying mental health issue. And when it comes to eco-anxiety versus climate anxiety, in many cases, they're used interchangeably. I think the term eco-anxiety encompasses more broad concerns about environmental change. So people might feel anxiety associated with the degradation of the environment due to pollution or with the loss of biodiversity. So it includes those different aspects of environmental change, whereas climate change anxiety or climate anxiety really focuses on that response to climate change in particular.
You've touched here on about at what stages climate anxiety could be considered a mental health issue, and that raises the question, is there enough awareness about the risks that the climate emergency is presenting to our mental health?
I can say that I definitely think there is not enough awareness of the threat that climate change poses to our mental health. And I actually want to just quickly describe, it's not just about anxiety. There are very direct impacts on mental health. If you experience some of those climate change impacts like major storms or wildfires, droughts can be, very disruptive and distressing. So we know that mental health problems are increasing because of those changes, and also because of higher temperatures, which are associated with increased psychiatric problems. And those dramatic impacts, I think, even people who know a lot about climate change are often surprised to hear about those mental health impacts or have them pointed out. And then climate anxiety in particular is important because you can experience climate anxiety even if you haven't directly been affected by the major storms or the droughts or the heat waves. So it has the potential to affect a lot more people.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that it can affect people who aren't physically experiencing these extreme weather events as a result of our changing climate. And I say this because I found in numerous conversations with followers here on YouTube and other social medias, people saying things like, well, I don't understand why I'm feeling these strong emotions about the climate emergency.
I think when I started to think about climate anxiety, what I was struck by is the fact that many people describe climate change as an existential threat. And what it does is really call into question some of the most fundamental certainties that we have, that the world is a fairly stable place, that things will continue more or less the way they have in the past. And so for people who are recognizing that that's not true, there's a profound cognitive shift that is extremely distressing and can undermine our sense of security in a very basic way, and just require you to rethink things that you were taking for granted. So I think it's that very fundamental aspect of climate change that's one of the reasons that people feel anxious. It's just it calls so much into question.
Yeah, sure. I agree with this. I've often had conversations around this fear of missing out. I've had people say to me, well, Greg, you're of that generation whom were able to get a job and who were able to have a car and who were able to buy a house. And we're not going to have that normality that you had. We've been promised that this is what life is about, but we're going to be the first generation that's poorer than our parents.
Yes, absolutely. I think, I've certainly heard climate activists say things like, how can I plan for the future when I don't know what the future will look like or if there will be a future? And even people who are more optimistic about coming to terms with climate change will often recognize that very profound things are going to change. We're going to be changing the way we live our lives. We're going to be changing the actual geography of the world. Some places will not be inhabitable that are currently inhabitable, and so on. So again, that very profound uncertainty, that sense that I don't know that I will be able to have the things that my parents had, and maybe I'll have some other things, but I don't know what those are. I think that's very disturbing.
Yeah, it really is disturbing. And prior to this interview, I mentioned that the majority of my viewership is from more privileged countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., whom, although many of these countries are experiencing these extreme weather conditions, just thinking of the bushfires in the United States, Canada and Australia, and even this flooding in Australia also. But I think it's also fair to say that most people are not on the front line. So for many, it's still yet a confronting issue and far from their daily lives. So I'm very curious, how does our economic and our geographic and maybe even our cultural context play a role in climate anxiety?
Yes, our social context, as well as economic context, geographic context, all of those things have a very profound effect on how we emotionally as well as physically experience climate change. So certainly some people, often people with fewer economic resources, are already experiencing the effects of climate change to a greater extent than the more privileged people. And even if they're not, they are often aware that they are more vulnerable. So that does you do see typically higher levels of anxiety in groups who know that they are more vulnerable to these potential impacts. Ironically, it is the case that awareness can increase your anxiety. So people who are kind of blissfully unaware of climate change or who completely deny it, they are wrong, but they're probably not very anxious. Some people might argue that there's a subliminal anxiety because they know they're wrong. So I would say that depends, but certainly the kind of social consciousness of climate change is going to affect your anxiety, but so is your sense that people are facing up to it. So one of the things that we found in a worldwide study I was involved in last year is that people had very negative evaluations of how governments were responding to climate change. They said governments were essentially failing on this issue. They were not living up to their responsibilities. They were not protecting their citizens. And this perception of government, failure and inaction was associated with kind of a stronger negative emotional response. So I think if you're in a society where you have confidence that those in charge are taking action to address climate change, that's probably going to reduce anxiety. So a positive impact of your social context.
Yeah, you mentioned perceptions of governments, and we are certainly living in times where there is a lot of distrust for our elected officials, and yet one of the biggest individual climate actions I believe we can take is to vote. I think when, coming to my own fears about the future, it is that our inaction now as individuals or collective to get involved in shaping our future, be it for ourselves or for future generations, some of these radical changes that need to be made to achieve net zero by 2050 are going to appear to be more forced upon people. And I fear that this is going to come as not only a huge shock for some people, but it's not without some backlash or worse, even civil unrest.
Absolutely. And I of course, have political opinions. That's not my area of expertise, so I don't want to go too far in that direction. But I do think the reason we have governments is because they, in theory, can take actions to protect collective well-being in a way that is unlikely to emerge from individual action. So I absolutely think that's their role here. And at the same time as having greater awareness of the climate crisis, we've experienced, in different ways around the world, a real decline in trust in our elected leaders, or in some cases not elected. So less, I think in many countries, there's less sense of the collective good, and more sense of, well, everybody for themselves, and we just assume our leaders are going to lie to us if that's what it takes for them to get elected. And in many political systems, the incentives for leaders are very short term. So climate change is requiring us to make changes now to avoid problems 10, 20, 50 years in the future. But people don't want to make those decisions, and in many cases politicians who try to make those decisions might get punished by the voters. So that's our dilemma.
Yeah, it really is a dilemma. And you mentioned just now that despite the fact of our growing awareness and experiencing different levels of distrust, in our politicians around the world, and the short terms of our governments needing to implement long-term changes, it kind of leads on to my next question. How we, the public, are perceiving the climate crisis differently around the world based on our geographic locations, particularly directed again to those of us who aren't on the front line of these extreme weather conditions, or for those of us living in more privileged countries. I recently heard someone make a statement that the climate crisis is the perfect storm in the sense of psychology, because if we are not confronted by something that is visible right now, it seems as though it's something that's coming in the future, and therefore we tend to delay things. And I'm quite curious to hear your thoughts about this.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. Some would argue that we have evolved as a species to focus on the short term rather than the long term, because as someone has said, in the long term we'll all be dead. So of course we need to think about feeding our families today and this year and the next few years, rather than what's going to happen in 10 and 20 years. Also, most people have a sort of an optimism bias. So we like to think, oh, things will turn out okay. And which is actually a very functional thing, because otherwise, we might be overwhelmed with despair all the time. But sometimes it's not realistic, or we don't recognize that, yes, oh, okay, maybe things will turn out okay, but only if we do something now to take action. So we do have to go against some fairly basic psychological tendencies to convince people that they have to do something about climate change.
Yeah, thinking in terms, as you say, going against some basic psychological tendencies to convince people to take action, I'm just thinking about how deep climate anxiety is in society. And a couple of weeks ago was Mental Health Week, and they released a very interesting statistic. And disclaimer here, as I hate quoting statistics without being able to back it up with more of a conversation, but just off the top of my head, it was presented that a global study that was conducted, 83% of children and young people already had a feeling that they had personally failed in protecting the planet. And this is deeply concerning, that they feel such responsibility so young. And so I'm curious, how do we take this dystopian outlook away from people to put in the utopian outlook? One where climate change action is positive, and actually in rethinking how we produce and do things, from the foods that we eat to our transportation to our energy supply, how this has actually many positive knock-on effects for many other societal issues and injustices, and we are actually building a better future.
Yes, I have several responses to that. One is, I think we need to be aware of this, in some ways, deliberate attempt to shift the focus from the system to the individual. So it's very easy for individuals to think, I have personally failed because, I fly too much, or I eat meat, or I didn't recycle last week. And we can all see the impact of our own actions, so that's not wrong. But the crisis we're facing is because of the systems that have been set up, and the way that governments have ignored information, and the way that industries have in some cases suppressed or manipulated information. And we're only going to succeed in mounting an effective response to climate change by changing those systems, and not through individual behavior. So individuals should stop feeling so personally guilty, is one response to that. And this morning I was hearing on the local news about a recommendation that children should be tested for symptoms of anxiety at a fairly early age. And I think there's been a lot of talk about anxiety and giving people individual resources to cope with anxiety, which is a good thing, but it ignores, again, those systemic factors that are contributing to or responsible for our anxiety. I also want to say that I think we do need to tell some more positive stories. And one of those positive stories is all the things that are already being done by people who are committed to trying to address this problem. And I always feel much more cheerful when I listen to climate activists or even climate scientists, academics like me, who are devoting a lot of time and effort to trying to understand this problem in the hopes of helping to bring about some ways of effectively addressing it. So there are positive stories there. There are, in some cases, more reasons for optimism than people are aware of, I think. And then the third thing is that I personally believe is that we often frame it in terms of, we're going to lose a lot. How can we minimize the number of things that we lose? But I actually think some of the changes that we should be making as a society will have benefits. I think we're more aware these days, for example, of the importance of having access to healthy nature, and that will not just protect the climate, but enhance our own physical and mental health. If we stop burning so many fossil fuels, that will benefit our physical health and potentially our mental health. If we walk around more, if we eat less meat, all of these things have positive side effects or even main effects in terms of improvements to our physical and mental health. And I think even giving us lives that are more thoughtful, perhaps, getting off, the rat race of mindless consumerism and so on. So, yeah, I would just like us to talk more about positive changes that we can make in our lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you raised the changing narrative here and the way that we can more effectively communicate through positive storytelling. I can speak from my own experiences here that in the early days of this channel, I was sharing a lot of facts that I've been learning, and I was criticized, a couple of times by people for fear-mongering. Now, despite these comments being taken out of context, of the broader conversation that I was having, I took that on quite seriously to become more aware of what I am saying and how I am saying it. And, the last thing I want to do is add to people's anxiety, effectively creating more inaction. But I'm curious, I still often focus on individual actions also. And I want to know, do you feel that communicating with these individual actions is important in helping the community take climate action? Or do you feel that this is redirecting their attention away from our need to focus on the bigger issues?
That's a great question. I think it's important to think of some individual actions because it makes it personal and real, and it can be empowering to people to realize that there are things they can do. They don't just have to sit around and wait for policy change and so on. But one of the most important individual actions is voting. Being politically engaged, or at least trying to effect systemic change, which can be through, communicating with companies, consumer boycotts, writing letters, those kinds of things. So I would like to think that it's not either or. It's important to let people know about the things that they can do, but also to encourage a focus on what can you do to help create these larger changes. Now, I think it's also useful for us to examine our own lives and how we can change individual household behaviors as well, because I think in many cases it will just contribute to our sense of ourselves as being responsible and effectively addressing the problem.
And earlier you mentioned your efforts at academic level of conversation, trying to better understand and find solutions. And this had me wondering, how are these important academic conversations that you're having really working down into real life practical solutions for the general public?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been very pleased to see, and the last 10 years or even 5 years, is increasing attempts at, certainly within my own field, which is what I'm most aware of, to find ways to have an impact. And so for a lot of clinical psychologists or mental health professionals, thinking about ways to actually provide uh, therapeutic interventions for people to help them cope with their personal responses, but also psychologists who are working to try and affect public policy, either by working with nonprofits or NGOs, or by communicating with, again, elected officials, with governmental officials. Several, psychological organizations that I belong to have grants specifically to encourage people to get involved in community efforts, by the way. So I think psychologists, and I think this is probably true of many academics and certainly climate scientists, are no longer thinking just about, in the past, maybe we have been overly guilty of learning things simply to publish them in professional papers that are only read by other psychologists. Increasingly thinking about how can we translate what we know about mental health responses and behavioral change, and have that be applied at a meaningful personal level.
And you also mentioned earlier that there is much more research that needs to be done into the emotional responses of the climate change. What in particular would you like to see being done?
There's so much. Certainly, when we think of climate anxiety, I think we need more research to investigate what are the most effective ways to help people who are experiencing high levels of climate anxiety, and maybe particularly for people who are actively engaged in trying to do something about the problem. There's the problem of burnout. So how can people stay engaged over the long term? And we definitely don't have very much research about these sort of long-term patterns of emotional response and also behavioral engagement. I'm personally very interested in understanding more about how these emotional responses to climate change are affecting not just behavior in the present, but also decisions about the future. So I think we were talking a little bit earlier about people who are having a hard time planning for the future because they don't know what the future will look like. And I think we have very little evidence yet, but some speculation about people making decisions about their future based in part on their awareness of and responses to climate change. So we've all heard about people who are deciding not to have children, for example. What else are people doing? Are they deciding not to save money? Are they deciding not to make long-term plans of one sort or another? So I think that's an area that we need a lot of research into.
Now, just a couple of questions for you personally. Firstly, I understand that you contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, and I'd love to hear about your participation in that.
Yes, this is very exciting. So for people who are not familiar with this group, it's a UN organization essentially that has been tasked with summarizing what is known about climate change. And they're supposed to produce reports, I believe, every 4 years. And there's kind of an ongoing infrastructure, but then for every report they produce, they recruit a number of scientists around the world. And I was fortunate to be chosen for the last assessment report that was released in last spring in March, I believe. And what our goal is not to it has to be received by governments, and that they don't want us to tell them what to do. So we're not making policy prescriptions. We're just summarizing, here's what we know from the research. And we're not doing any new research, again, just summarizing what is already known. So, but there's a very high level of a threshold of acceptance. So what we put in the report is essentially, it's not just one study, it's the result of multiple studies and generally accepted by the relevant scientists. It was wonderful to be able to participate, partly because this is the first IPCC report that has really stressed mental health as one of the impacts of climate change. There was a little bit of reference to it in the previous report, but we really developed that idea in this one. And so I was very glad to be able to contribute to kind of highlighting and publicizing that impact. And then I just found it very personally rewarding because this is an organization that brings together hundreds of scientists from around the world, and it's definitely very international. They try and get as diverse a group as possible, both in terms of where you're from and also ethnicity, gender, things like that. And it's a lot of work. It is not a paid position. So here were these hundreds of scientists putting all this effort into producing this project, and you have to say they're not going to do this if they don't think there's any point. So these are people who believe that we can do something to take a more effective response to climate change. And so that by itself was just inspiring and helped keep me optimistic.
And finally, with COP27 coming up in Egypt, do you have any expectations?
I have expectations, and I have hopes that there will be further emphasis on environmental justice as part of the reason we need to respond to climate change, and on mental health impacts. I know that there are organizations that are really working to try and establish networks to address, for example, some of the psychological factors of our responses to climate change. So, I don't necessarily expect particular policy responses, although that would be very nice. But what I do expect is at least we're keeping the issue alive, and I think with every one of these meetings, adding nuance to people's understanding of what climate change looks like and how it's being experienced.
Dr. Clayton, I can honestly say it's been a real pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you again for this incredible insight into your field and research and your contributions. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
If you've been experiencing any of the powerful emotions that we discussed in this episode, particularly if they're impairing your ability to live your day-to-day life from work to social interactions to sleeping, then please do seek advice from your doctor on what services are available to support you. I would love to hear your thoughts and questions on today's discussion. Please do leave your comments in the comment box below. And if you enjoyed this episode and would like to support me and the channel, then please consider using the thanks button below this video. No matter how big or small your donation, it goes a long way in helping me to make these videos, and of course it's greatly appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please show the YouTube algorithm that you enjoyed this video, with a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel and be sure to click on that bell for future updates. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, please take care.